good morning to all of you and welcome to the second day of the South Asia Economic Summit. Before we proceed with the second plenary session, we will now move on to a book release. To introduce the book, I cordially entitled Manufacturing and Jobs in South Asia, Strategy for Sustainable Economic Growth. I cordially invite Dr. Sabyasachi Saha, Assistant Professor at RIS.
Very warm good morning to everyone. This book, titled Manufacturing and Jobs in South Asia, Strategy for Sustainable Economic Growth, published by Springer, is also in a sense a tribute to Dr. Saman Kelegama. He was very much part of this book project in the initial stage. He attended the first workshop meeting in Delhi. Having said that, let me briefly introduce the whole idea behind the book. This book has been published under the auspices of the South Asia Center for Policy Studies, SAES, which is a dialogue platform on shared destiny on South Asia, steered by veterans like Professor Rehman Shoban, Professor Mujkund Dubey, Dr. Babar Ali. Current co-chairs are Professor Deepak Nair and Professor Akmal Hussain, with several think tanks from the region as partners, including those that are the founding institutions for SAES. This publication stands testimony to the commitment of the partner institutions, and it deeply acknowledges the support that we receive from Professor Deepak Nair, who has also written a marvelous foreword for this volume. Most contributors are present in the room, and I thank all of them. This book addresses a very important question. Whether we are convinced in this part of the world about manufacturing, whether manufacturing stands the scope. Our beliefs are sometimes shaken. We are slightly overwhelmed because of several legacy issues and also the kind of structural transformation that we have experienced. The dominant narrative is that of frustration around missing the bus. We often tend to blame the kind of the trade regimes and the integration process in the last 20, 30 years. For Nepal, the chapter by Dr. Posh and Dr. Diliraj Khanal brings out the investment and policy coordination challenges. For Bangladesh, by Dr. Mozem, brings out the challenges of graduation and the issues around diversification of sectors and exports. For Pakistan, by Dr. Suleri and his co-author, it's more about the infrastructure and the inefficiencies. For India, we have dealt at two levels. First, at the level of the trade regimes and the experience with the trade regimes, and at the second level about skills and technology. The volume rightly articulates that industrial resurgence in this region is linked with 3 S. First, size of the firm, linked with capital investment, scale in production, linked with market size, and skill for the labor force. The ultimate policy objective lies in promoting 3 preconditions. First, industrial policy that also includes trade policy, macroeconomic policy that generates the investable surpluses, and public policy for quality of employment and skills. With this, I thank IPS, I thank Dr. Dushni and Dr. Janaka for this wonderful opportunity to allow us to present this book before all of you and disseminate this important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saha. We now move on to a very interesting plenary panel on meeting challenges in the new world of work under the fourth industrial revolution. Moderating this session is Dr. Radhicka Kapoor, Senior Fellow of the Indian Council for Research and International Economic Relations in India. Dr. Aliya, the panelists are Dr. Aliya H. Khan, Professor at the Quaid-i-Azam University in Pakistan, Dr. Posh Pandey, Chairman of SAWTEE, Nepal, Dr. Fahmida Khatun, Executive Director, CPD, Bangladesh, Dr. Vikrom Mathur, Founding Director, TANDEM Research, India, and Dr. Lei Song, Regional Economic Advisor, the South Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank in the Philippines. I cordially invite the moderator and the panelists to please take their seats on stage. Dr. Radhicka Kapoor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here at SAES. It's really a pleasure to be here, and more so because I'm here to be a part of a conversation on the future of work, which is not just desirable at a forum like this, but I think it is completely essential. And we've heard all of yesterday how the world of work is changing at a magnitude and a pace that we're struggling to grapple with and understand, let alone respond to. And the changes in the world of work are being driven by a multitude of factors, not just the technologies which are underlying the fourth industrial revolution, but also by the forces of globalization, climate change, migration, and urbanization. And all these transformative changes are collectively shaping the jobs of the future by shifting jobs across sectors, by changing the kind of tasks that we are doing in existing occupations, by changing the way people connect to work, and also by altering the standard employer-employee relationships. And what is more is that these changes are not going to impact everyone equally. There are some people who will bear a disproportionate burden of these changes, while others will have it far easier, and this is going to exacerbate overall inequality. And these changes will again not just play out differently at the individual level, but also at the level of countries. The ILO in 2016 released an Inception report on the Global Commission of the Future of Work, which had released its final report earlier this year. And what they said was that there's really no single future of work. The way the world of work will evolve across countries will depend on their own social, economic, historical, cultural factors, and therefore it's going to evolve in a different way in each of these countries. So I'm really delighted that we're having this conversation here in the context of South Asia, because we need to factor in the heterogeneities in the way the world of work will evolve in this discourse. And this is also very important to my mind, because for those of us who worked on the issue of future of work, when we start actually researching, we realize that much of the current narrative in the literature is actually dominated by the advanced or the developed world. And this is despite the fact that in a global workforce of about 3.4 billion, less than 20% are actually in the developed world. And the semantics and the metrics of the debate in this part of the world are in fact quite different from what they are in South Asia, which is really representative of the global South. So therefore, I think that this is really a very important session and a very important forum for us to have this conversation. Also, the nature of challenges that are going to be faced in South Asia, I think, are going to be of a completely different order and magnitude as compared to what the global north is going to face. And I'm sure that all the speakers are going to touch on these issues in their own country-specific context. But there are two things that I want to highlight, which I think would be common across all countries. One is that the avenues of productive transformation, structural transformation that were available to the developed world when they were developing and growing might not actually be available to developing countries. Sabyasachi touched on this issue in his keynote, where basically in the developed world we saw the transition from the agricultural to the industrial to the services sector. But now in South Asia, where still a large proportion of our workforce is trapped in the agricultural sector, we're really grappling with how this process of structural transformation is going to play out. Because we know that agriculture is going to employ fewer and fewer people, which is not essentially a bad thing, it's actually a good thing maybe, because a lot of the work that's being done in the agricultural sector is actually very arduous and full of drudgery. But then the manufacturing sector, which has actually been the engine of growth and job creation in much of Southeast Asia, that avenue may no longer be available to us as well as we adopt more capital-intensive techniques of production, as we talk about automation and robotization. And at the same time, I also feel that the modern service sector may not be able to expand at a pace that is fast enough to create jobs for much of South Asia's workforce, which is really, unskilled, low-skilled, and medium-skilled. So I think the issue of structural transformation is a very important one in the context of how the labor markets will evolve in South Asia. And the second issue that I want to flag is really that of informality. And again, in much of South Asia, most of the workforce is trapped in informal work arrangements. Most people are doing low-paying, low-productivity jobs in the informal sector. And again, the ILO in a report that was released in 2018, where they provided estimates of informal employment, said that about 72% of the workforce in South Asia was trapped in what they call vulnerable and precarious employment, and they don't see that changing. They projected that that's not going to change very much over the years. And in contrast, in the developed world, the share of vulnerable employment was just about 9%. So I think these statistics highlight the stark differences in the labor markets of the global south and the global north. And what they also tell us is that the challenge for South Asia is not simply one of productively absorbing the new entrants into the workforce, but also that of transferring the large masses of our workforce which are trapped in low-paying, low-productivity jobs into high-productivity, better-paying jobs in the formal sector. And a lot of this challenge is also compounded by the fact that in the fourth industrial revolution, a lot of the new work arrangements that we are seeing emerging, such as gig economy, which are outside the ambit of standard employer-employee relationships, are also essentially informal in nature. So we're also grappling with this issue of whether, these new work arrangements, if they are indeed going to increase informality, is informal employment going to become a norm rather than an exception in our part of the world, given that we're already dominated by informal work arrangements? Now, of course, these are all very daunting challenges, but at the same time, I do believe that there are enormous opportunities, in particular for South Asia. I would say extraordinary opportunities, actually, because there are parts of South Asia which are still to see the gains of the first three industrial revolutions. So there are enormous gains to be made, but how we harness these opportunities is going to depend critically on our policy responses. Because eventually the future of work is not going to be just shaped by all these forces of technology and globalization and so on and so forth, but also our policy responses. So we really need a decisive path of action ahead. So with that note, I'm going to stop, and all the panelists are going to have 7 minutes to begin with, and I would urge them to really touch on the issue of how they think their labor markets will be impacted in this discourse, and also perhaps to begin with touch on what are the key policy responses they see, and then we can delve into more detail as we go along. So we'd start with Dr. Aliya Khan first.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to be invited to this very, very timely and important debate on the future of work and the fourth industrial revolution and how it unfolds in South Asia. I would just like to remark that I hope the future of work for me does not lie in an 18-hour travel from Pakistan to Colombo next time. So with this, what I'm going to try and do in the allotted time is to identify some issues that we should now, as researchers and as inputs to policy makers, should be concentrating on. First of all, we have to analyze the technology absorption potential for our countries and for the whole South Asian region. Because in order to really assess the impact of the fourth industrial revolution on the job market, on the labor market, I think we need to move beyond the debate of the channels to how exactly the impacts are going to be compounded on the labor markets. And there is some research on quantifying the impact of technology on job losses and on job creation, which I think is important now for us to consider. And the risks that are now becoming more evident with the fourth industrial revolution unfolding are also linked to how accurately we can assess what is going to happen to jobs and the nature of jobs in our labor markets. And as we know that the fourth industrial revolution is placing great value on the cognitive and socio-behavioral skills, and those are in demand in terms of replacing the repetitive jobs which will be automated. Now, in which sectors are these repetitive jobs most at risk of being replaced by the new skill demands is a moot question for us to try and answer. And I don't think that at least in Pakistan, there is this recognition at the policy level that this is how we will be preparing ourselves for the fourth industrial revolution and the future of work. And also, as Radhicka pointed out, the ILO declaration, centenary declaration, and the resolution passed at the United Nations General Assembly 74th session regarding the human-centered approach to the future of work is, I think, something that we need to be cognizant of, because as we have been talking about, the informality of some features of the 4IR in terms of the gig economy, the digital platforms, is something that needs to be addressed through the ways, the traditional ways social protection has been available for workers in the labor markets of South Asia. And the whole employer-employee relationship concept has been altered. So technology is disrupting the production processes, it is disrupting the traditional employer-employee relationship on which our labor laws have been formulated and developed. So I think as a labor economist and as a person who is very deeply passionate about how 4IR is going to impact the work lives of the workers of South Asia, I would just urge that the discourse now should be more focused on how actually the impacts of the 4IR are going to play themselves out in terms of changing the dynamics of the labor market. And I'm very glad that when I started researching for this panel discussion, I found very good publications that one can take advantage of. And the latest publication for the ASEAN region, I think I would urge all of the people who are really interested in how policy responses should be shaped up to have a look at. And that has just been launched by ILO. And it is an extremely interesting documentation of the country policy responses to how they expect to incorporate these issues in their national policy documents. So, responding to what Radhicka was saying in terms of policy responses, I don't think that any of the countries really has a policy for the future of work which is all in one place. There are fragmented policies like the digital and the IT policies do not speak to the work lives of the people. So I think we need to bridge those divides, and I can't ignore the red flashing in my eyes. So I'll stop here and more later when we have the second round. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khan. I think you raised a really pertinent set of issues, and I'm very happy that you raised the point about the human-centered approach. And I think for anyone who's interested in looking at the future of work, it's absolutely imperative to look at the ILO Centenary Declaration on the future of work, which essentially places a human-centered approach, how we invest in people, their skills, the entitlement to lifelong learning. And I hope we'll get into more of this discussion in our second round. But I think the point that you started with, Dr. Khan, was also very important about the technology absorption capacity of these nations. Because when we have this discussion, we assume that technology is just this exogenous force. And just because something is technologically feasible means that we will in fact adopt that technology. Whereas that's not how it will play out if we don't have the necessary enabling factors that allow us to actually adopt that technology. So thank you very much for those insightful comments. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Posh Pandey from Nepal.
Thank you, madam. Well, I mean, when I was listening to the discussion and debate yesterday, I mean, I get the impression that the hopes as well as threat of this fourth industrial revolution is being amplified. I mean, the reason being, as you rightly pointed out, there have been a lot of studies with regard to the developed countries, not with the developing countries. And we are having our conclusion based on the studies of developed countries. I think that's the reason. And here, again, I mean, while it's talking about this implications of fourth industrial revolution on, I mean, future of job. Well, we have to look at what kind of task is we are performing. I mean, let's have, a matrix, 2 by 2. Generally, tasks either it is manual or is cognitive. And at the same time, either it is routine or it is non-routine. So we have, 4 elements in this matrix. Regarding manual, routine and non-routine. That computerizations, I think, most of the developed countries, and in some of the developing countries, it has already taken up. And regarding to non-routine and manual. If you look at this development in artificial intelligence, I see a lot of scope to take over those jobs by machine. But for non-routine and cognitive, I think machine can't perform that task, even if there is a lot of progress on deep learning. So, while talking about this job, I think we need to conceptualize task along these lines, and we need to analyze the situations. And based on this, these criteria, again, looking at the report by developed countries, okay, they say even in old banks, maybe 2/3 of the job in developing countries that could be wiped out, through automation process. But here the issue is, as an economist, here the purpose is, the objective of any organization is to maximize profit by the combination of machine and labor. So here, technologically that could be possible, but is it financially feasible to maximize profit? I mean, in southern countries, labor cost is quite low. So any entrepreneurs may not substitute labor for machine with high cost. So I don't see, much threat on labor market, particularly in the number of, labor. And again, the focus has been basically on the number. I don't see, much impact on the number. But other issues, particularly quality of the job, that is another issue. It has promoted gig economy. So you don't have, secured permanent job. There is, and you don't have, quality, this work space or quality will be deteriorated. That is another factor. And another issue is with regard to the social security. Basically, generally, minimum wage is attached with the permanent job. And if you don't have any permanent job, then you are going to lose social security. And another issue could be, it might promote discriminations, particularly discrimination against women, and maybe discrimination against some social group. That could be another implications of this economy, this gig economy and fourth industrial revolution. And another issue could be that income inequality. Here there will be polarization of work. And if you look at the contributions of profit, capital, and labor at national income, contribution of capital would be increasing and contribution of labor would be declining because of polarizations of the work. And that increase inequality. So the issue is how we are going to address inequality. And another issue is particularly industrial relation. In gig economy, there is no personal contact among workers of the same enterprises. And there won't be any opportunity to form this trade union or to have this collective bargaining. And that might result in the exploitations of the workers. In Nepal, as you rightly pointed out, most of the workers are in low salary, low productivity agriculture sector. And these sectors are basically informal, and in our case, it's more than 90% of the workers are in informal sector. And another, coming back to the four industrial revolutions, access to technology. There is digital divide, and for most of the workers and enterprises, they don't have access to technology. So again, coming to your point, we need to assess that technological, how we are going to absorb that technology. We have to assess that capacity. So here again, coming to the policy. Our problem here is we have overemphasized economic growth rather than employment. So we need to reorient our policy from economic growth to employment. That one, policy. And again, yesterday, our colleagues are talking about that addressing digital divide, another factor, and also, that putting efforts on education, particularly digital educations. And much more important factor is we need to have this digital industrial policy. And our finance, public finance should be aligned, particularly with regard to expenditure on infrastructure that has to be aligned with that digital industrial policy. And once again, we need to go for regional cooperations. for this.
Thank you very much. You raised so many pertinent issues, and I'm glad that you brought out the point that the challenge in the future of work is not just one of jobs, but also of distribution of income, and grappling with inequality is going to be as difficult as sort of rehabilitating workers who might lose their jobs during this process of transition. But the last point that you made is actually something that we all need to reflect on, is the increasing disconnect that we are seeing between economic growth and employment. And much of our policy in South Asia is really guided by the fact that when economic growth happens, jobs will be created, and employment is an assumed derivative of the growth process. And I think that not just because of the fourth industrial revolution, but a multitude of factors, there is this disconnect which is happening. So we need to place the maximization of employment and not just the maximization of GDP at center stage. So thank you very much for bringing out that point. And now I'd like to turn to Dr. Khan from Bangladesh.
Thank you. Khatun.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, Khatun.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank IPS and also the co-partners for organizing this. I'm sorry that I could not attend yesterday. And I'm sure a lot of discussion had happened like this morning. As you have set the stage in the beginning, so if we summarize is that there are three scenarios we can see. First one is that technology or automation or fourth industrial revolution is going to have an alarming impact on the labor market, because particularly so in South Asian countries where we are seeing a structural transformation, which you have mentioned, that we are gradually, we have already moved away from traditional agricultural production to manufacturing and to more on service sector. And as a result, economic growth has happened, Posh just mentioned. But what we are observing is that jobless growth. This growth has not been able to create enough job on the one hand, and secondly, as a result, inequality has not been also narrowed. So, and we are in the process of completing the third industrial revolution, which is based on information and communication. Since South Asian region is comparatively behind in both in terms of economic progress and also technological progress, we are yet to take the full advantage of the third industrial revolution. Now, when the fourth industrial revolution is knocking at the door, the impact is going to have really prominent. And this is real. The advanced countries are already in the process of observing, and they are in the process of preparing as well. But we are yet to prepare, as you have mentioned. This is the first scenario. The second scenario is that technology is not bad. We have seen the first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, third industrial revolution. Well, at the beginning, there is always a challenge, a fear, apprehension, but somehow the labor market adapts to that situation. Some really adapt very well, but some less nicely than the others. However, we do move on. That's, so there is nothing to be worried about. Rather, it's going to improve the lives. It's going to facilitate our ways of work. We would love to work less, let the machines work more, and I would rather work for 5 hours instead of 10 hours a day. So I love technology. So this is a good scenario, and at the same time the productivity will be increasing. So we'll have more time to invest on discussions like this, not just sit on the desk. Rather, we can have intellectual exercise, or we can have coffee, or whatever. We can go for movies. So from that point of view, technology is really a life changer. The third scenario is that we are yet to know that what exactly the impact would be. I can tell, particularly in the context of Bangladesh, that I am yet to read any assessment or a study which points out that what are the jobs which will be going away. We know, of course, that the repetitive jobs, the jobs which require less skills, immediately they will be gone. But on the other hand, there will be more new jobs. So if we consider the last 2 points, then we can think of the policies which you are emphasizing on. So first point is that we have to depend on the political decisions rather than the market. Market cannot solve. So active policy measures have to be taken into consideration. The first one, of course, it has been mentioned by the previous speakers, the labor market policy, that in order to create more employment and the employment which can actually face the new industrial or fourth industrial revolution, which can be, suitable for the new scenario of the fourth industrial revolution. So that brings us to the issue of skills and education. The education we are having, that we are stuck in the numbers, as much as we are stuck in the GDP numbers, we are also stuck in the numbers of enrollment rate or the rate of education, but not the quality of education. Now, a lot of emphasis is being given by the policymakers on skills development. Even the private sector is taking initiative. But have we analyzed the impact of skills, or have we really gone into examine that what kind of skills we are giving? Lot of initiatives, but those skills are probably not catered to the market requirement. So that's another issue. Now, this brings us to the issue of fiscal policy. In an economy where you have competing priorities, whether you will invest on health or technology, or you will invest on education or skills. So I can talk for Bangladesh, with an allocation of 2% in GDP for education, what kind of education can you expect? What would be the quality or what would be the skills? So the fiscal policy has to really emphasize on more allocation or more public expenditure on the education and for the quality of education rather than just the numbers or outcomes. We have won prizes during Millennium Development Goals, and also now we got some prizes in New York just the other day. So, but we have to come out of that. And the other issue related to the fiscal policy is, again, there will be always the winners and losers, and there will be some losers who will take a lot of time. Maybe they will never can go there, take advantage of the whole innovation and technological upgradation. Those who are lagging behind, those who cannot the capacity either physically or economically, for that active fiscal policy such as social protection, allocation for social protection, social safety net. So that policy is yet to be in place. We have in our country national strategy for social security, but in order to implement that also, you need resources. So resource mobilization is a real problem. With a tax GDP ratio less than 10%, we cannot do this. We'll have to really increase the resource mobilization from domestic sources, less dependence on the external sources, because even at the global level, the flow of resources is drying up. So we'll have to focus on our own resource mobilization through active resource mobilization. And again, technology can help there also. I mean, in this day and age, we are still not observing an automated taxation system. So, that is another, again, the political decision. So political decision or the policy makers have to be have to take the determining role. That's all. I think my time is up. We can come back again.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khatun. We'll definitely be coming back to all those questions, because when we're talking about these policy responses, it's all very easy to say that, skilling for all, universal entitlement to learning, social security for all, but do we actually have the fiscal space to be able to implement those policies? And more importantly also, you raised the point in the beginning about how, nobody can deny the fact that technology is going to create gains in the long term. It's going to improve standards of living, and so we stand to gain in the long run. But it is going to disrupt lives in the short run. There's going to be a considerable amount of displacement in the short run. And it's going to be a painful transition for those who are losing their jobs at that moment. And we have the example of the Luddites, which is the most often cited example in this context. So how are we really going to compensate those losers to move towards a more painless transition? So we'll definitely get back to all those issues. Thank you very much. And now, Dr. Mathur.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think one thing that I want to do at the very onset, I think as researchers, before we talk about the future of work and the fourth industrial revolution, we need to actually deconstruct the notion of the fourth industrial revolution a little bit. And as sort of a sociologist of technology, I find it really difficult that we assume that this is some kind of a linear trajectory and it's progressive and both outside our control, and technology is coming with its inner logic. So I would like to suggest that we need to think first about the fourth industrial revolution as a socio-technological imaginary, and it has, within its kind of framing, there are ideas, values, interests, and knowledges which are embedded, and we need to understand that it's not just a materiality question. So these socio-technological imaginaries are both descriptive of attainable futures, but they are also prescriptive of the kind of futures that ought to be attained. And I think that is really important to think about. And very often, these imaginaries are performative, in that they mobilize actors and exercise political power. And as such, through informing and shaping trajectories of research and innovation, or through mobilization of resources, and legitimation of policy processes. So I do think that we need to think about the fourth industrial revolution, and we need to deconstruct it, and we can't assume this is some kind of technological monster that's knocking on our doors. The other issue I have sometimes with economists, and I think you touched on it a little bit, is the idea, I think you have a theory which sounds like creative destruction, cyclical regeneration. As an anthropologist, I think of it as kind of a myth that a lot of economists have, that in the long run it'll all work out. So there'll be winners and losers, and there'll be creative destruction, and in the long run it'll all work out. So I think these kind of theories about the fourth industrial revolution in technology also need some examination. And as you rightly pointed out, there are winners and losers. So I think then I move very quickly into the actual question, and I'm going to kind of construct my response on the impact of the 4IR and whatever that 4IR is, on three things. How is it changing? How is it causing job displacement? I think the other thing is about employment quality and conditions. And the third thing we want to talk a little bit about is the impact of this on the persistent labor market inequities. And I do have some thoughts on where we might find future jobs and what kind of policies are needed, but I guess that'll come out a bit later. I think in the question of job displacement, I think the whole game about number of jobs, and I think that's a difficult question and I don't think one must answer, but I do think that we can easily conclude that technology adoption is going to lead to some sort of polarization. And I think that polarization and hollowing out of the middle, as some people have called it, is really critical. It is particularly critical in the context of South Asia, where that middle path is a path out of deprivation. It's a path of social mobility, right? So it'll create this kind of have-nots that don't have the trajectory or the path to move forward. I think that's a really important question. I think at the kind of level of services, and particularly technology-related services, we have seen with IT sector, and particularly in Sri Lanka and India, both the financial sector, that although there will be new jobs at the more specialized roles, which will require lifelong learning, but the entry-level jobs of data entry, bank teller, and many of those service jobs are going to get increasingly automated. So again, this is that problem that low-skill jobs that are available to lower-skill people are going to get automated. I think this whole idea of the platform and the gig economy is super interesting. We are doing a lot of research on it. We are doing ethnographies of a lot of platforms. And I do think that in the long run, the platforms are, as you said, creating a new form of informality. You think that the beauticians working on Urban Clap in India now have bank accounts and hence they have joined the formal sector. No, they have not joined the formal sector. They're on 4 different apps. They're looking for jobs and they're facing all sorts of precarity. And recently, California has legislated that Uber is an employer and not a platform, but at least in the South Asian context, all these platforms think of themselves technologies and not platforms. Another thing that I got really alarmed recently, I was having a conversation with Urban Clap itself, is that their business model is not that they're going to get share of the wages of these beauticians. Their business model is that they're going to lend to these beauticians. So ultimately, they are going to capture the market and provide small to medium loans of 4,000 to 5,000 rupees at the end of the month at 25 to 30% interest. So really, really dangerous old forms of exploitation are going to emerge. I have several other issues in there, but I just quickly want to talk about employment conditions. I think one of the big issues is that non-standard forms of employment are likely to increase, right? Particularly for low-skilled occupations. I have our colleague sitting here whose work we have cited in a paper we've done in Sri Lanka. And then the issue of dilution of collective bargaining, which is something that ILO thinks a lot about, and that these technologies will lead to situations where the opportunities for unions to function and operate and bargain collectively are going to get severely damaged. We also looked at how emerging tech is used for HR management, for hiring, for surveillance and monitoring of staff. And yes, at the high end, it is leading to working from home and flexibility of work and many of these opportunities. But at the lower end, it's leading to more surveillance and dangerous HR practices. That AI is biased against women in recruitment. This is a highly cited example, but you will definitely find these biases which are already in society getting coded into algorithms for recruitment. Sorry, I'm almost at the very end of my time, but I mean, obviously, I think we do think that the gender question in the future of work is something that requires special attention. Ma'am yesterday talked about the persistent low labor force participation, and I think, again, the gig economy will provide opportunities for women who want to work from home. Yes, it will increase their burden. Nobody's going to take their care burden away. But again, this is a problematic category. We can't just assume that, oh, you now don't have to travel to work and it's safer, so you'll be much happier. I think other thing that is also part of a lot of literature that's emerging, and I've run out of my time, I'll take 30 seconds more, is that and this was, we thought in the case of Sri Lanka, we thought that there are a lot of regional disparities in both skilling and the way industries are located, and those regional disparities are definitely going to get reproduced, if not further entrenched, right? So that's really an issue, and then a lot can be said about how current social biases are reflected particularly in access to technology and also skills and education for technology, and again, the issue of the reproduction of these biases and their entrenchment. I want to end with that. I do have some more thoughts on what a future area where future jobs could lie. So I don't want to be completely kind of pessimistic, but I will say some good things later.
No, I think that's very important because Essentially, the challenge for us is not just about the number of jobs we create, but the quality of employment. And I'm really glad you've raised this point about the quality of employment that is being created through all these platforms, because it's all very well to say that, you know, there are 1 million Uber and Ola drivers. Really, we need to think more carefully about the conditions of their work. They're not covered under the ambit of any sort of labor regulations, any minimum wage. They don't have any health care. And while the example that you cite of California is a pertinent one, the bill that they've just passed to say that Uber drivers are in fact workers. And even in India right now, we have this new draft social security code which says that the gig workers will be covered by it. But I mean, it's challenging in terms of, I don't know how it's actually going to pan out, because the argument of all the platforms then is that it's going to disincentivize them and it might hurt job creation. So, you know, that's one thing. And of course, the very important point about the exploitative nature of work in these platforms and what it does to the bargaining power of workers vis-a-vis the employers, more so because the workers who are working in these platforms are not actually organized. You know, so they have no collective representative voice against these exploitative conditions. So thank you very much. And now we turn to Dr. Saul.
Thank you. And first, let me thank the organizers to have ADB here. And we are very pleased to come here and to listen to all these views. As the last speaker in the panel, it's quite difficult because they have already covered almost all the areas. So I have to say something different, otherwise everybody can pack and leave. Yeah, so I pick up something Radhicka and the previous speaker said a few times. The long run, the short run. So long run, I think everything would work out, no issues. And economists usually favor new technologies because we know new technology will boost productivity, create better paid jobs and economic growth. So in the long run, it's okay. But unfortunately, somebody already said in the long run, it's really tragedy. Actually, somebody else also said, it is the short run in where historical horrors happens. So it's the short run. Actually, we pay attention to the short run. So they have already discussed all the policy response to the short run. In the short run, how do we address all these issues? And ADB has done a big study last year. There's our flagship publication we called Asian Development Outlook 2018. We published a study on how technology affects jobs. And Dr. Pandey has this 2x2 matrix, and this is a very standard literature about how look at automation and artificial intelligence, its impact on skills. So everything is said there. Everything is very nice. So you will create new skills and create new jobs. But then I would like to give you a new perspective. A very simple one. Yeah, we know production function, we know technology can be labor saving, can be labor augmenting. So if it's a labor saving, then you would save labor, and then you will get rid of labor in the process. And if it is labor augmenting, then you would increase the demand for labor. And the innovation, I think if you classify innovation, it also can be a very simple framework. You can have product innovation, which, because it will innovate, it will produce new products. Then it's labor augmenting, so it will increase the demand for labor. But it can also be labor saving, so that's a process innovation. You just increase the efficiency of the process of producing product, and it will save labor. But actually, I believe economists, we don't know much about the interaction of this labor saving, labor augmenting, or product innovation and the process innovation for specific new technology. Sometimes we think they might be labor augmenting, they will produce more products, but it may accelerate the process, make the production process so efficient. And now this word is a globalized word. Yeah. It may globally, it will, may create new products, but it's just produced somewhere else, not in your country. Then you cannot benefit. So this whole, how to make innovation, new technology to your advantage. So those policy response to the new technology, I think they have already discussed a lot, but I would like to emphasize, if you were sitting in the session I was speaking yesterday, then you might know what I want to say. Actually, we should get the basics right. We need to get the basics right to make the technology work to your advantage. Why I say to get the basics right? Because when you, then we go back to the Econ 101. You have to find the niche to exploit of your comparative advantage. So you have to get the basics right. I think developing countries, why we are developing? Probably because we don't get the basics right. And because we don't get the basics right, we are closed very much. Our trade is highly protected. We have a very bloated public sector, and the competition is not so high, and the private sector cannot develop. And if the private sector cannot develop, then they couldn't exploit comparative advantage the country you can have. So I think if we go back to the basics, and for any technology, if you any technology come, if your country can get the basics right, I think they can work for your favor. And I think you can accelerate this process from the short run, where historical horrors happens, to the long run, the bliss point, so everybody is fine. Then the economy can grow faster, and you will create more better paid jobs, and everything would work out. So I would reiterate, we need to foster private sector development. We have to help SMEs to develop, to take advantage of the technology and to exploit comparative advantage your country can have. Some countries might have absolute advantages, but even absolute advantage, somebody would produce a little things to have a comparative advantage. Then the economy should open. Otherwise, with closed economy, you can't go anywhere. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting that the last speaker points out how important it is that we should go back to the basics, and that's really true in South Asia, because we've not been actually able to turn our comparative advantage into a competitive advantage. And if we want to harness the gains, all these technological gains, we need to go back and make sure that we're able to exploit our comparative advantage. And that will also help in enabling a more smoother transition in the short run. And well, the short run, I have to say that in the long run, we're all dead, but the short run really is a lifetime for most people. And so therefore, we have to think also about the pain that will happen in the short run while this entire transition process is happening. So before we give the speakers another chance to speak, we can perhaps open the floor and take a few questions. No questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. There is a new trend in the corporate sector about, giving earlier concept was primacy of the shareholders. Now it is the primacy of stakeholders, and the reporting on the triple bottom. The impact on society and the environment have become very important and revealing. So, for example, companies like Uber will have to start reporting on the impact they are making on their people as it goes. So as we say, I think, the long term or in the medium term, all these things and the fears about the OIR having a short-term impact negatively will get adjusted when the primacy of stakeholders come into effect.
So I'm very grateful to Dr. Mathur and Dr. Song about when they talk about, especially the sociology of technology, you know. I was impressed with that term because I did not know. Hearing the discussions today and yesterday, I feel that economy and society are not getting linked so much, you know. There's a bit of a, it's almost like economies exist in a vacuum rather than talking about the underlying causes, societal causes, which lead to the inequality that we are facing today. And we have touched upon the marginalization of women, the redundancies impacting women, just touched upon them. But I feel that the great historical defeat of women brought about the introduction of tools that Engels talked about a long time ago has still not been addressed sufficiently. I would really appreciate from the panelists if they could talk a little bit about what are some of the measures that have been taken to reduce the marginalization and the inequality of especially women using technology and also policies, so at the government level, society level, technology and policies. Thank you.
An observation, the challenges of technology tend to fall a lot on the labor force. On one side you have jobs disappearing, on the other side you have new jobs that may get created but which require different skills. So how do you move from jobs that are lost in one category to something that is, and how do you change your labor market policies to have a very flexible, adaptable labor force? Now, in Sri Lanka, we have inherited a very Anglo-Saxon model of very adversarial sort of labor relations. How do you move to something that is more collaborative, perhaps a Scandinavian or a German model? I can illustrate with just a couple of examples, perhaps. Now, we have a government electricity utility. They were trying to, we have problems to a certain amount of leakage due to power piracy. The electricity board was trying to introduce the smart meter. You install it, it automatically gives the readings back to the board. The billing is automatic. But the installation of these meters was blocked by the Union of Meter Readers. So we have people who go on bicycles and read the meter, write it and come back. So now that for the moment is stopped. But the question is, how do you deal with the problem? How do you manage, just to illustrate that if you go to a government department in a lot of departments and you step into the lift, there is a person sitting in the lift who is pressing the buttons in the lift to go up and down. So now in the private sector, now in the 1950s, everybody had them, but now the private sector you just go and press. The government has installed the new lifts, but they still have a person sitting there pressing the buttons in the lift. So again, nobody's asked the question, what do you do with these people now? The government is still keeping them, but it's not really a very productive job. But how do you change your policies to accommodate this? Thank you.
One question.
Thank you, Chair. Excellent deliberation of the panel. I think one issue which we should deliberate on is access to the fourth industrial revolution technologies. Many of these technologies are under patenting and licensing. And I think that along with the discussion that it might have disruptive implications for our job market, we should also think about what is the global architecture of access to these technologies, democratization of that access. Because what I think is that down the line, it will not be that we'll be discussing about the disruptive implications of technology, but we should be discussing about how to access the technology. So I think that is something that I think we should deliberate on. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think a lot of Good questions there. And just to add, now I think maybe we'll deliberate a bit more on the policy responses, and on that I want to pick up on the skilling question. I think there is unpredictability about where the jobs are going to come from, and perhaps Vikram, you can speak a bit more. You were saying you've done some work on where you think which sectors will create jobs. But essentially there is a lot of unpredictability about where the jobs will come from, which sectors will create the jobs. So the question then is that what kind of skills do we need to impart people at this point to prepare them for the jobs of the future? Now, of course, we know their cognitive skills, the advanced cognitive skills, their social behavioral skills, their skill of adaptability. All that is really imperative to prepare people. But we also have this whole literature on which this, the hollowing out hypothesis is based, which essentially says that it is manual and routine tasks that machines will do. But what we see with artificial intelligence and machine learning is that it's not only the manual and the routine tasks, but it's also cognitive tasks that increasingly machines will be able to do. So what sort of skilling architecture should we be thinking of in this scenario? And also, I mean, not only are the labor regulations very Anglo-Saxon, but even the skilling architecture, we have very little involvement of the private sector. And like you said, you know, Vikram, the way technology evolves is not exogenous. You have to factor in the choices which are made by the actors in the world of work. And in addition to the workers and the government, the firms are very important because they are the ones who are going to be adopting these technologies. So they have to be a part of this process. The private sector has to be a part of this process of preparing us for these changes. So I think we can give all the speakers about 2 to 3 minutes to respond. Is that one? Okay. Okay, we'll give everybody 2 minutes to respond and say.
Should I?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I want to just touch a couple of points. I think they're really complex, interesting questions. I'm not going to say anything on the industrial relations questions. Perhaps somebody else is better placed to respond to that. But on the question of skilling, I think one of the things that is obviously coming out, and I'm quoting a colleague of mine who says this, that we won't skill our way out of this, right? It is not a skilling question. It really says that we have to go back to the foundational education, and it's about the ability to learn throughout your life, and it's the ability for lifelong learning as job transition happens, which will become more important. So this whole focus on let's skill and we'll get our way out of it is not the option. The other myth is that let's get digital skills, right? It's not just about digital skills. It's about creative thinking. It's about design skills. It's about skills that help you learn new things, right? It's not just about digital skills. So for us, at least, we think of it as going back and thinking hard about education, K5, K12, you know, and not just thinking about what the IITs will do and what the advanced centers will do. You have to go back and think of schooling. Obviously, there is a case to be made for industry academia partnerships, particularly as it relates to the high-end skills on IoT or AI, and you know, so and I know that NASSCOM in India, and we are doing some work with them, is thinking quite hard about it, right? So I think that K12, K5 lifelong learning skills and those top-end skills. But I think, I mean, this also then relates to I want to segue into the gender question. I can't answer the gender question. I think it's a really complex question. I do think one of the things that everybody seems to say is, and maybe Ramani should answer this question in the next session, but I think one of the things that many people seem to say is that the care economy is going to be where a lot of jobs will emerge, and those jobs in some sense will be shielded from automation because we don't want robots taking care of our kids and adults. I don't know if that's a good argument. Like, I'm not entirely convinced about it, but definitely I think in the case of Sri Lanka, where there is the demographic transition is very different from the rest of South Asia, and there is an aging population, and there is need for geriatric care, and so on and so forth. There is something to be said about kind of, you know, recognizing that care is work and creating a more robust care economy. And I think, but I think at least in the case of India, even when we talk about, you know, Internet SAWTEE and all these programs about gender-based digital training, it's not really leading to empowerment. You know, it's not leading to empowerment. I almost think you need like a revolution, and I don't think either a technology or a skill or education is actually going to change the mindset that actually I mean, we have done some studies where about mobile phones, women don't have access to their mobile phones, they share it with their family, anybody can look at their messages, right? So I don't think technology is making things better for women. I don't think so. I mean, obviously.
Dr. Khatun and Dr. Khan, I'd like you to come in on that.
Yeah, let me address the gender issue. Now also, and in the past, and maybe in the future also, the most marginalized group in terms of access to employment is the women. One of the reasons is that, of course, lack of education, lower access to education, and also the other part is that, taking the burden of the care economy. So the policies for women's participation in the labor market have to be twofold. Economic policies, of course, give them more education, and education is not just, education, lifelong education, which has been mentioned, and also skills development. But these also have to be complemented by social policies, because you give education, if a woman is quite skilled and ready to go to the job market. But again, what about the care economy? What about looking at the children, looking after the older people? And also the other aspect is that, particularly in our country, and I'm sure in many South Asian countries, also the phenomena is that giving them the security. Those women who come from villages, where do they stay? How do they, commute from their home to the workplaces? A lot of insecurity, and so that is also related to the social and cultural issues. So investment has to be not only on education, but also social improvement of social and cultural issues, which can change the mindset. This is one. And also the active policies, because as we have always discussed, that positive discrimination, that has to be pursued all along. In many countries, countries like the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, which are the countries of in modern times, social welfare dependent countries. Women have 1 year leave from workplace. Even the fathers also have about 9 months leave. So those types of enabling condition will help them to come to the job market in a better way.
Absolutely, thank you. Dr. Khan, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I think I'm again going to stress that we need more in-depth labor market diagnostics, because what I'm gathering from our conversation is that there is a lot of unclarity on what exactly are going to be the impacts of the future of work and the 4 IR on the way labor markets function or do not function in our part of the world. And I think the way labor policies are formulated has to change, because we cannot really wait for the way labor policy formulation takes place. The pace of policy development has to change and respond to the call of the times, and we need policy disruptions, I would say, and for that the diagnostics and the data that feeds into these disruptions is very important. And I think the whole set of parameters that are used to map gender inequalities also needs a relook. The way gender studies is taught needs to respond to this issue also, because what I feel is that the traditional curricula relating to labor markets also is up for a rethink, and as Vikram very nicely said, that there is a lot of deconstruction that is needed. And I think the issues of what labor market indicators do we use to map whether the lives of and the quality of work of workers is desirable or not desirable, vulnerable, precarious, that all is in question also. So it's very exciting since a whole new path of inquiry has opened from all these discussions, but we need to get to it on a timely basis, because whether we like it or not, the change is there, and we need to recognize in which way we need to reorient our research efforts to protect the lives of workers in a better manner in South Asia.
Thank you. That's really important, because if our policymakers are really looking at sort of metrics which provide a half-baked picture of the labor market, obviously our policy responses are not going to be appropriate. Nobody talks about the quality of employment. We look at an unemployment rate and we look at an employment rate, and only those of us who are really interested would dig deeper into what we can gather from the data about the quality of employment, the number of hours people are working. So the issue of data is very pertinent as well, Dr. Pandey.
Okay, I just want to, point out the difference, and particularly while talking about the skill, and the difference in fourth industrial revolution and up to third industrial revolutions, particularly with regard to skill. So here previously, we gain skill at academic institutions or university, and we work. But in fourth industrial revolutions, we work and gain skill. That's the difference. So here, there is a lot of responsibility for the individuals. Here, learning is lifelong. So you need to continue skilling yourself, or sometime de-skilling and sometime re-skilling. So you need to continue that process. That is one. And I just want to address on issues of technology. Well, Dr. Mustafiz rightly pointed out. In four industrial revolutions, those who own technology own the whole world. And technology owner is a master, and maybe virtually others are slave. Why I am saying is, we have Uber in India, or Ola, or in our case, we have that kind of a facility in Nepal also. But who owns that global positioning system? That's the Google. So Google is the master, and we all are slave. So that's why technology is the most important factor here. So maybe we can go for initiate that open sources technology, particularly for among developing countries. And another approach would be of WTO, but I think it has become defunct as TRIPS Article 66 provisions. And the UN has established a technology bank for LDC. Well, maybe we can go for digital technology bank for developing countries, or middle income countries. We can go for, so that we can access technology.
Thank you. I think we've not discussed the power of the Big Four, but I think it's been discussed in the other sessions. Dr. Song?
Okay, I just want to touch on this gender issue. Yeah, I arrived in India. Yeah, I visited India a couple of years before I moved to India in May last year. So that was really striking to me, because then I knew the data. Okay, the women labor force participation was only 25%. You compare to East Asia, Southeast Asia, usually those countries have a female labor force participation double this level, if not triple. So it's really striking, and I really couldn't understand. But then leaving there, I saw some issues. Yeah, even my wife feels the unconscious bias, discrimination, you would say, from Indian males. So I think there are some deep-rooted issues. And all those issues, you can take care over the long term. Hopefully in the long term it will change. But education may improve that. And political leaders need to take a lead. Yeah, they have to be conscious. I think people need to be conscious. They might have a very unconscious discrimination against the women. So ADB has done quite a bit. Now we require all projects have certain elements of gender equality. So doing something, a little bit, whatever, as long as we can facilitate the role of women in the society, to increase their economic security, economic role in the society, would be helpful. I think all the small steps would help. Should I just stop here?
Thank you. I think we're pretty much out of time. Did you want to say something? Oh, there's still something. Okay, you want to say something?
If I may, if there's time. It's
Yeah.
not. Okay. No, I just wanted to quickly react to this question of the big tech that you implicitly raised. And I think we have to think about that question also quite hard, because there is this concentration of knowledge and power, and the way digital infrastructure and data is constructed, there is this kind of reinforcing effect of it. And obviously, I know this debate, you have antitrust laws and competition laws to kind of break up these monopolies. And you can also think about self-regulation, which is what all these tech companies want to do. But I think at the end of the day, what I find, and this is what I want to say, that in this kind of science, society, technology space that we are now entering, I think what we need is more societal capacity to actually be able to understand and follow these things. So we need more tech society research. We need better kind of institutions at the university level, and so on and so forth. Like, I mean, if I look at the US and the departments on AI and its ethics and governance, it's all over the place. AI Now, every university has it. We have now started a small one-credit course at IIT Hyderabad on AI and social justice, but you can't talk to Indian technologists about ethics and social issues. I think social scientists are seen as Luddites, unfortunately. And I think what we need to recognize is that in this phase of technology transitions, you need the social scientists.
No, absolutely, and I think we should also stop.
Just pitching for myself a little bit.
I mean, we need to sort of understand where the Luddites were also coming from, because it was a very difficult process of transition for them, and they did lose out in their lifetime. Since we do have 5 minutes, there's one issue I think we didn't touch on, which is quite relevant from the South Asian context, is global value chains. Because global value chains have actually created a lot of jobs in South Asia, and it was essentially the availability of cheap labor here that enabled them to do it. Now, with all these technologies which are basically leading to adoption of more labor-saving techniques of production, cheap labor is becoming a less important factor in determining where you're going to locate your production. I mean, this is, the phenomena of reshoring. I mean, we've seen some evidence of it, like Adidas set up this automated speed factory in Germany where they took away jobs from Vietnam. General Motors had a factory that provided radiator caps in India, and now they've moved production to Austria, if you believe it, and apparently unit costs are lower there. So if any of you would actually like to comment on how this phenomena could also impact the labor market.
Okay. Sure. Okay, I think you've touched upon a very relevant point, and that is how the servicification of manufacturing is impacting the whole global value chains and the geography of jobs. And I think it's very important because South Asia is actually playing quite a big role in terms of Bangladesh and India providing the kind of freelancing service jobs that are feeding into the global value chains. However, I think we need a better understanding of, how it is transforming again the labor market features of South Asian countries, because again, those kinds of jobs are not accounted for in the traditional labor force statistics that are, being compiled and tabulated and used for giving a picture of the labor market scenarios in South Asian countries. So I think what I said earlier was, I would just like to reinforce that we also have to have a more connected and interdisciplinary approach to the way future of work and the 4IR is unfolding and impacting the labor markets of South Asia, and both men and women. And also, just very quickly, I'm going to say that the backward linkages to the education system and the traditional ways of skill delivery are also obviously, as Vikram also pointed out. But what I fear is that the policy lag in our countries is so great that it takes years to change the education policy and the TVET policy, that we have to figure a way out in terms of also the reducing the policy lags, because this is coming on so fast that the traditional way policy development takes place is not going to be suitable enough.
Thank you very much. I think the point about servicification of manufacturing is actually very important when we're having this discussion about structural transformation. We probably can't think of it in silos, the transition from agriculture to manufacturing to services. But I think that this has been an enormously rich discussion. It's very difficult to actually summarize what's been said here. But I think while there are challenges, enormous challenges to my mind, but there are also great opportunities which are lying there for us to harness. And whether we're able to harness them or not, like I said in the beginning, is going to depend critically on our policy responses. And there I'm going to borrow from your phrase, Dr. Khan, of policy disruption, because these changes are coming on so fast that we need serious policy disruption in terms of how to tackle them. The issue of lifelong learning, entitlement to lifelong learning for all is absolutely essential. Social security for all, the idea of a universal labor guarantee, which ensures that people, get decent conditions of work, decent living wages, regardless of what is the nature of the relationship they have with the employer, is exceedingly important. Our policymakers need to think of all this very carefully, given that we have limited fiscal space to in fact do this. So we need to, prioritize these things very carefully so that we can craft a more equitable future of work where we can compensate the losers. Otherwise, the social consequences of this transition, where the losers stand to gain so much, are going to be enormous. And because this is in the South Asian context, I think we'll all also have to get together and think how regional cooperation can help us weather these challenges, because like Vikram, you pointed out, the demographics are quite interesting in this region. Sri Lanka is already aging. Bangladesh will start aging before India. So I think that there is tremendous scope for cooperation here as well. And on that note, please join me in thanking all the panelists. I think we've had fantastic discussions this morning, and thank you all very, very much, each one of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radhicka Kapoor. And could we please have another warm round of applause to the entire panel for an excellent discussion on the future of work under 4IR.